World War II was an unparalleled catastrophe in human history, claiming tens of millions of lives across the globe. While civilian casualties were immense, the death toll among men, particularly of military age, was devastating. In many regions, entire generations of men were decimated, leaving villages, towns, and even whole regions profoundly altered. Countries such as the Soviet Union, Poland, Germany, and Japan experienced losses so severe that, in certain areas, men simply disappeared from society, leaving women, children, and the elderly to struggle with the aftermath of war. The scale of male mortality during this period was staggering and, in many cases, permanently shaped demographic structures and social dynamics for decades. The Eastern Front was particularly lethal for men. The Soviet Union alone suffered over 8 million military deaths, most of them male, due to combat, starvation, and harsh winter conditions. German forces on the same front lost millions, often in brutal engagements that left entire units annihilated. In Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltic states, mass executions, forced labor, and reprisals targeted men disproportionately. Villages were emptied of their male population, leaving women to manage farms, households, and communities under extreme stress. The psychological and social consequences of such losses were immense, as men had traditionally been responsible for defense, labor, and family protection in these societies. In Western Europe, men also faced enormous mortality, though the causes were slightly different. Bombing campaigns, occupation, forced labor, and military conscription claimed millions of lives. In France, the Netherlands, and Belgium, male populations were drawn into resistance movements, drafted into forced labor in Germany, or killed during urban combat and reprisals. Across the continent, young men between the ages of 18 and 35 were particularly affected, creating demographic imbalances that were felt long after the war ended. In some towns, the ratio of women to men shifted dramatically, leaving widows and orphaned children behind. The Pacific Theater added to the devastation. Japanese, American, and Allied forces suffered enormous male casualties in battles, such as Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and Guadalcanal. Entire units of soldiers were killed, leaving few survivors, while civilians in the occupied territories also experienced targeted killings and conscription. In places like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the atomic bombings not only killed tens of thousands instantly, but disproportionately affected male workers and military-aged men who were in factories or mobilized for defense. The human toll in Asia mirrored the demographic disruptions seen in Europe, with men's absence reshaping families, economies, and societal structures. Famine, disease, and forced labor further amplified male mortality. Prisoners of war, conscripted laborers, and men trapped in occupied regions were often subjected to starvation, exposure, and brutal working conditions that proved fatal. In many cases, surviving male populations were weakened, reducing fertility rates and slowing post-war population recovery. The combination of direct combat, targeted killings, forced labor, and secondary effects such as famine and disease ensured that the male death toll was not only high, but geographically concentrated, leaving certain areas with virtually no surviving men in specific age groups. As World War II progressed into its final years, male mortality reached catastrophic levels in many regions. In the Soviet Union, German advances and counterattacks left millions of men dead, with entire villages in the Western territories depopulated of male residents. Young men were conscripted into frontline units and rarely returned, while men in rural areas faced executions, forced labor, or starvation. In some Polish and Ukrainian towns, records show that nearly all men of military age were either killed or displaced, leaving women to rebuild communities under impossible conditions. The demographic imbalance was so extreme that marriage patterns, family structures, and labor distribution were permanently altered. In Germany, the last months of the war and the subsequent Allied occupation further decimated male populations. Young men had been drafted into the army from the beginning, and those who survived battles often faced capture, forced labor, or death in retreating columns. Cities such as Berlin, Dresden, and Hamburg lost significant portions of their male populations due to bombing raids, street fighting, and reprisals. By the end of the conflict, some regions had more than twice as many women as men, forcing dramatic social adjustments and changing the post-war workforce and family dynamics. In Asia, Japanese and Allied military campaigns also led to staggering male casualties. On islands like Okinawa, entire battalions of Japanese soldiers perished, often alongside male civilians conscripted for labor or defense. In China, military-aged men were killed in battles or massacres, leaving women to protect and feed their families under ongoing occupation and famine. Even in liberated territories, the absence of men slowed reconstruction, reduced labor availability, and caused long-term economic and social challenges. In many regions, men's absence was so severe that entire generations of women grew up without fathers, husbands, or brothers, leaving psychological scars that lasted for decades. Counting the exact number of male deaths during World War II is extraordinarily difficult, but historians estimate that of the roughly 60 to 70 million total deaths, approximately 40 million were men. This number includes soldiers on all fronts, conscripted laborers, and civilians caught in bombings, massacres, and forced relocations. In some areas, men of specific age groups were almost entirely wiped out, creating a demographic vacuum that affected fertility, labor distribution, and the rebuilding of post-war societies. The scale of loss is almost unimaginable, and the impact was not limited to population statistics. It reshaped economies, politics, and family structures in every country involved. The absence of men left a lasting legacy on post-war life. Women assumed roles traditionally held by men, managing farms, factories, and households while coping with grief and trauma. Societies were forced to adapt to this imbalance, and recovery was slow and uneven. In some towns, the loss of men permanently altered cultural norms, gender relations, and social expectations. The psychological impact on families and communities cannot be overstated, as countless children grew up without fathers, husbands without wives, and elderly parents without sons to care for them. World War II demonstrated not only the destructive power of modern warfare, but also how the systematic loss of men could change the very fabric of societies, leaving an indelible mark that would be felt for generations.